action of you.
Oh, okay.
So
Sorry, I didn't realize that.
sorry about that. So good
Why don't you
morning,
go ahead,
everyone.
Joe?
Yep, I'm starting. Yep, happy Friday, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker from UW, Dr. John Hokanson. I think you guys may have already know him, but still, right? Dr. Hokanson has been with our group since 2000, and he has extensive research interests related to congenital heart disease. And among these research interests, he's especially interested in the detection of critical congenital heart disease in newborns. During the past 20 years, well, almost 20 years, he has been collaborating with the Wisconsin State Department of Health Services on the SHINE project, which is an acronym for screening hearts in newborns. In this project, pulse oximetry is used as a method to screen for critical congenital heart disease in newborns, which can be unnoticed for the first few days after babies are born and only make them significantly ill after they go home from the hospital. With this, please join me in welcoming Dr. Hokanson as he is going to present on this topic.
Thank you, Joe. Sorry for jumping ahead of you there. So I think this is a little more storytelling than science, but I think that's okay. And what I was going to talk about how things have gone here in the state of Wisconsin over the last some number of years. So I'm going to try to advance. Hopefully you guys can see that. So rewinding the clock a little bit. So back sort of at the turn of the millennium, we had a strategy to find babies with critical congenital heart disease before they really got into trouble. And that's the goal of this whole process. So it was really a several layered process. Certainly we would examine every baby when they were born. We were getting to the point where prenatal ultrasounds became the standard for women in pregnancy. And then we'd shift to a fetal echocardiogram if there were complications of that prenatal ultrasound or if that mom was at particularly higher risk for congenital heart disease. And so that was the strategy we're using. But unfortunately, it wasn't quite perfect. There were still a lot of cases of congenital heart disease that was missed by those screening processes. So thinking about the components of that, well, how good is the physical exam? Well, it turns out we looked at that by looking at babies at Meritor who had a heart murmur. Nothing else. They weren't obviously ill. They didn't have some high risk feature. They didn't have an abnormal fetal ultrasound. And so we looked at the echocardiograms that were done. That was back in the day when we still weren't quite as assertive about using echocardiography in the newborn nursery. So we had this quantity of 354 babies that had gotten an echocardiogram just because they had a murmur. Well, if you can read some of the small print on there, about half of those babies had an echo where we really couldn't even figure out why they had a murmur. Nearly the rest of the half had something like a small PDA, a small VSD that wouldn't really need a lot of care going forward. Some of them did need to go to the NICU for sure. In the end, 4% of those babies had something that would need attention mechanically, either a catheterization procedure or a surgical operation. So can't really comment on the sensitivity of physical exam, but the specificity was maybe not so great. So certainly just having a heart murmur gave you about a 4% chance of having some sort of significant heart disease. Well, how are we doing with prenatal diagnosis? So the team over at Milwaukee looked at the babies that came to their hospital and tried to figure out how easy was it to get a prenatal diagnosis and who was more likely to be diagnosed prenatally. I'm guessing you can't see the diagnoses at the bottom of the screen here because the letters have to be really small. But what I'd have you notice is that some heart diseases are easier to find than others. If you looked at the overall prenatal detection rate, it improved pretty dramatically between 2007 and 2013. And not too surprisingly, if you lived in a bigger city, you were more likely to have an accurate prenatal diagnosis. This is really good. And a lot of states would be really impressed by that and not be able to hold a candle to that, but it's still not 100%. So the real question is, how often was it a really bad thing to have missed that critical congenital heart disease? So we looked at how often that happened. And how we looked was to look at Wisconsin's records to see babies who were discharged with a discharge code of normal newborn who came back into the emergency room, hospital, or died at 2 weeks or less with a diagnosis of critical congenital heart disease. In that 5-year period, there were not a huge number of kids where that happened, but there were certainly an important number. There were 9 children that died before their heart disease was detected, 5 that got readmitted with that new diagnosis. So about 3 times a year in the States, something that we wish wouldn't happen was still happening. So we looked at that, and our theory was that that would be more likely to happen again if you were in a rural area or in a smaller hospital. And when we looked at it, again, the numbers were pretty small, but it didn't really seem like hospital size mattered. What we hadn't really thought about in designing that study was that some people weren't born in a hospital at all. And when we looked at the home birth community, kind of by accident, because they were just a leftover from our tables, there was a lot, maybe more home birth problems than we thought. So home birth only recounted about 1.6% of the births back then, but they were quite a lot of the missed congenital heart disease. So instead of hospital size, could it be that home birth was a risk factor for missed congenital heart disease? So that's something we're going to sort of put a pin in and come back to later on. So following a sort of disjointed timeline a little bit more, so in the early 2000s, there was some interest growing in using pulse oximetry screening for detection of critical congenital heart disease. So when we went to Meritor, the state's biggest nursery, and said, hey, maybe we should try this. Turns out, unbeknownst to me, despite being on the faculty there for a long time, that every baby born at Meritor was getting 4 extremity blood pressure measurements, hopefully within the first hour after birth. Now, for those of you that aren't clinicians, that's a ton of work. And it also is probably way too early to be even remotely possible to be helpful. So I was a little surprised by that. And the nursery committee at Meritor says, well, pulse oximetry isn't ready for prime time yet, but let's at least switch the blood pressures to an arm and a leg and kick it out to 24 hours where it might be more helpful. A little more time passed, a little more literature showed up, and we started doing single site pulse oximetry just in the foot in the babies at Meritor starting in 2007. So we were a little ahead of the curve against some places. And then we realized that all of that data starting in 2008 was getting poured into the EPIC system. Now by 2010, we'd sort of given up on the blood pressure screening, and I'll show you why. But we did have 10,000 babies who'd had it done. So we looked at that to see if, well, maybe could the blood pressure screening pick up coarctations in a way that would be helpful? 10,000 babies for that purpose is actually kind of a small study, but it was at least something. And what we found in looking at the data very closely is it's a ton of work even to do 2-site blood pressures. And a great many babies had multiple measurements, sort of keep checking the blood pressures until you get a number you like and then stop. With that, we found that the number of babies that failed their blood pressure screening was much higher than the ones that failed the pulse oximetry screening. And again, in this small study, it didn't really detect or miss any critical congenital heart disease. But what we learned from that is blood pressure screening for arch obstruction at 1 day of age is a ton of work, and it's still probably being done too early to pick up coarctations. So I didn't really have a whole lot of enthusiasm to keep pushing blood pressure screening, and I'm not aware that anybody else has taken up the charge on that point. Now, the literature got better, and in 2009, the group out of Sweden published their study, and this is where everything changed. All of the previous studies were reasonably small, had maybe shown you had a better chance of making the diagnosis. But this study showed that not only did you have a better chance of making the diagnosis, you had a substantially less chance of dying before your critical congenital heart disease was recognized. So they compared two groups, the control area where they just went along as business as usual, and then the oximetry area where they did screening. In both cases, their prenatal detection rate was less than 10%. So there was still a lot of babies to be picked up postnatally. In the control area, you had a pretty high chance of going home before your diagnosis was made. And there was a 5% chance you would die before somebody figured out you had critical congenital heart disease, which is a little daunting. And on the oximetry side, the chance of going home undetected dropped pretty significantly. And in the smaller group, there were no children that died before that diagnosis was made. And so when this paper came out, that's when things really began to change and people began to think, hey, this is the way to go. So in 2012, late 2011, the US government put out an appeal for proposals for grants to start building pulse oximetry systems in the US. So we applied for it and found out in 2012 that we were one of the recipients of this grant. And what we were able to do is work off the existing infrastructure in the Department of Health Services to build a CCHD screening protocol. So that's where this SHINE project came through. So it was the education, technical support, and assessment of pulse oximetry screening for CCHD in Wisconsin. And it had a 3-year lifespan, and that was enough time to get the ball rolling. So one of the first things we looked at was our concern that maybe home births were a risk factor. And all of the pulse oximetry literature that had been out there was really done in large hospitals in really well-controlled circumstances. And as I've been learning, Wisconsin isn't quite like that. Wisconsin has a ton of small hospitals and close to 100 midwives practicing, which isn't exactly the same control you get in a large newborn nursery. So we published this first preliminary data on the first few hundred babies that were born at home. I think what we could show from that is that we could do it. We didn't detect any critical congenital heart disease that way, but we did identify 2 kids with infection a little earlier than we might have. And 1 kid that failed had an unbalanced atrioventricular canal that was sort of borderline, but eventually went on with a 2-ventricle repair. Like a lot of pulse oximetry screening programs, we did miss 1 critical congenital heart disease, and that was a baby with a coarctation. Coarctations will be sort of the problem child going forward. So I think what we showed in this early data is that you could do it. I think it was too soon to say that we knew exactly what it meant, but at least you could pull it off. Now, after a couple of years, we were able to get more data. So this is 2013 and 2014's data on home births. By then, we had 1,600 babies born at home with data on them. And in that, we differentiated between plain community births and what's the plain community refers to as the English community. So that's everybody else. And curiously, it turns out in those 2 relatively similar sized populations, none of the English births had complications of critical congenital heart disease. And of those 800 home births in the plain community, 5 of them had critical congenital heart disease. So that got us to wondering, is it really being born at home, or is it being born into the plain community that matters? Now, it turns out once we sort of went to the Department of Health Services and talked about this with them, our project was the only state project that was keeping track of whether or not you were in the plain community. And that made some people uncomfortable. So after this data was collected, we got the message that we were no longer supposed to collect information on whether you were in the plain community or not. So going forward, we went a little dark on that particular issue. So now we're a few years later, we're beginning to get the big data set, and this is a 9-year data set, and Tyler Legro has been working on this. He's just finishing up this project. We designated those 12 diagnoses that had been outlined in previous recommendations, and also created a hierarchy so that one baby got one major diagnosis and then secondary diagnosis. It turns out in some of the prevalence data, you could have a baby that showed up twice. So let's say a baby had truncus arteriosus with an interrupted aortic arch. We would count them first as the truncus. Or if they had hypoplastic left heart syndrome and an interrupted aortic arch, or total veins, let's say, we'd count them as hypoplastic left heart syndrome. Again, just to make sure that every baby only got counted once. This is Tyler's data on the 9 years of the study. The purple line shows the continued improvement of prenatal detection over that timeline, which fits with the previous data for Milwaukee. Timely diagnosis meant either by physical exam, pulse oximetry, or whatever reason before the baby left the hospital, and late diagnosis after the baby left the hospital. So there was still a handful of those, but in general, the timely diagnosis and the late diagnosis tended to decrease, again, because more prenatal detection was being made. These are the heart diseases that fell out of that project. As you probably won't be surprised, tetralogy of Fallot and coarctation were the two heavy hitters, followed by a decreasing frequency of a number of different heart diseases, with a total of about 17 of these critical congenital heart diseases per 10,000 births. That's similar to other literature, and how that literature changes across the world is a more complicated story that we'll maybe pass on for today. So again, we were finally able to start pulling some data out of the system after quite a few years of inputting it. And now Sridevi Mohan has sort of taken up the mantle of reporting on that data. She actually has several projects going in her PhD program. One is to look at how this pulse oximetry screen worked in the real world versus what we actually got reported at the DHS. Again, comparing the home and hospital births. Another project at looking at the downstream effects of critical congenital heart disease. What other things did you find? What other trouble did you cause? And then the last project she's working on will be looking at the demographic features and how that shapes either how often you're likely to get congenital heart disease, how likely you're able to get it prenatally diagnosed, and maybe how pulse oximetry performs based on those criteria. So this is that long awaited data set. Just a reminder, it wasn't until 2014 into that data set that required us to get the reporting from places. We basically have some data on all the babies with an expanded data set on those babies that either failed their screening or were found to have congenital heart disease, either at Children's Wisconsin or AFCH. We looked at those charts to see what tipped people off that there might be critical congenital heart disease there. And then we tried to figure out and clean up the data based on times when maybe that screening wasn't done well, or maybe shouldn't have been done at all. It turns out a lot of the pulse oximetry screening in the early days was even done on babies that had a prenatal detection of critical congenital heart disease. So I don't think you need that smoke detector if you can already see the flames coming up from the couch. So we decided that wasn't an appropriate use for the screening. So what I'm going to finish off with is some of the preliminary results we're working on, and sort of focus in again on that home versus hospital birth question. So this is the data that we had. Overall in that timeline, there were quite a few babies born. We identified those nearly 1,000 babies with critical congenital heart disease. And we identified whether they'd been born at home or born in the hospital, and also what the prenatal detection rate would be. So for those of you that don't spend your lives thinking about critical congenital heart disease in newborns, if you have a diagnosis of a critical congenital heart disease, you probably are not a candidate for home birth anymore. And the only home birth we had in that criteria was one baby that decided they didn't want to wait to go to the hospital. So that was an unintentional home delivery. But that made us think, well, wasn't home birth supposed to be this risk factor for congenital heart disease? And again, we're going to get back to that in just a minute. But if we look at the whole data set, this was the real world, not the perfect world. We had out of that group 5% that we really just didn't have reliable data on. Obviously, the vast majority of babies had passed and a certain number had failed. A certain number of babies were not screened for appropriate reasons. If you'd already had an echocardiogram that showed your heart was normal or abnormal, you probably didn't need to screen anymore. If they found out you had hypoplastic left heart syndrome when you were 20 weeks gestation, again, you don't need that smoke detector to look for a fire there. You already know it's present. So certainly a lot of kids didn't need to be screened. Unfortunately, if you had a child that wasn't going to survive, it also didn't make sense to screen for them anyway. After we tried to sort of sort everything out, we probably had 525,000 babies that really were screened, appropriate and that we had good data on. Of that, less than 400 failed, and again, the vast majority passed. So this is breaking down that set where we really have pretty good data. The prenatal detection, the detection of critical congenital heart disease by pulse oximetry was a relatively small percentage of the total. Only about 5% of all the kids with critical congenital heart disease had their first clue being a failed pulse oximetry screen. It was about the same in the hospital, but interestingly, in the home birth community, there were a good chunk of the kids with congenital heart disease who were picked up on the pulse oximetry screening, and you were an awful lot more likely to fail your pulse oximetry screening if you're born at home than if you were born in the hospital. So what's the stuff that the pulse oximetry picked up? Well, it was those 48 critical congenital heart diseases, more kids with significant heart disease, the most common being an atrioventricular canal, but also aortic stenosis, pulmonary stenosis, a couple of important cardiac tumors along the way. There were a number of kids that had fairly significant lung disease, a spattering of kids with infection, and some other disease processes that could cause cyanosis along the way. The downside was that quite a few babies ended up having to leave the place they were born to get their evaluation. Again, if a baby's born in a center where you can have the echo machine roll right into mom's room and do the echo, that's a little bit of a delay in discharge and a little bit of anxiety. But if you have to move the baby potentially away from where mom is to check things out, that doesn't always come easy. So how does it stack up statistically? If you look at all births, the sensitivity is limited. The specificity is really high. The positive predictive value is different between in hospital and out of hospital. So if you get a call that a baby in a hospital failed their pulse oximetry screening, there's about a 1 in 9 chance they have critical congenital heart disease. But if you get a call from a midwife, statistically, the chance that baby has critical congenital heart disease is more like 1 in 4. Of the diseases that got missed, coarctation was by far the most troublesome. And again, that's a story for another day. And again, if a prenatal diagnosis disqualifies you from home birth, how come these data sets are so different? And I think we finally got that figured out. So it turns out that home births really aren't all the same. If you're born in the plain community, what we saw is less than a third of those women had a prenatal ultrasound of any kind, and many of those prenatal ultrasounds were not what we'd think of as a standard 20-week OB ultrasound. Almost nobody in that community has ended up getting a fetal echocardiogram, and the prevalence of critical congenital heart disease probably is higher than the general population. Whereas the English home birth community, 70-75% of those women do get a prenatal ultrasound. And again, once you start doing all those prenatal ultrasounds, you're likely to pick up the congenital heart disease and then say, hey, you're not a home birth anymore. So these are two really different communities. In the plain communities where the pulse oximetry might be really the most important because you've got a low prenatal detection rate and probably a higher prevalence. In the home birth community in the English side, it's probably much more like the hospital community where it can be helpful, but it doesn't carry quite the same punch as the home birth community in the plain side. So, sort of wrapping things up here, there was an infinite number of ways that things could get messed up, but it seemed like it turned out pretty okay. Even with our very admirable 70% prenatal detection rate across that timeline, we were still picking up about 5% of the babies with critical congenital heart disease with pulse oximetry. And I think the take home for the clinicians is if you get a call from the nursery and the baby fails their pulse oximetry screening, yeah, there's a pretty good chance they really are going to be fine. But there's also a 10% chance or more that they have a life-threatening heart disease. And I think it's pretty easy to justify doing an echocardiogram or a little more assessment under those conditions. And again, in a community where there's a higher chance of having congenital heart disease and a lower chance of picking it up prenatally, I think this is an even more important tool. So I think pulse oximetry is still useful until we get to the point where all of the kids are detected prenatally. I think we've been able to show that we can do it in the real world. And one of the things that's been different in Wisconsin than in other places is we got the mandate that people not only had to do the screening, but they had to report it. And that allows us to understand what we're talking about. And again, this data that we've collected has also given us some important data to look at the prevalence of congenital heart disease in the state. And as Sridevi works on, maybe some of the socioeconomic factors that may really be important in that congenital heart disease in the first place. So there's a ton of people that have done this work. There's the team in Milwaukee. Joe Block's been leading it with Laura Burkhart and the research people before Laura. Zhao, Sridevi, and Cassie Nelson here in Madison, and many of the predecessors there. The leadership and a ton of people at the Department of Health Services have been helpful. All of this data has to come in and be manually entered in the State Lab of Hygiene. So they've been doing a ton of work for a really long time. We got great buy-in from the Wisconsin Guild of Midwives. And again, all of the people standing next to the baby taking care of them. So it's been a large amount of work. I think it's been helpful. I think we've helped out a handful of babies. And I think we've helped us understand congenital heart disease in our state a little bit better. So I'm bumping right up to the 9:30, and I don't want to cheat Janette out of any time. So I think I'll call it a day there. If anybody has one or two questions, maybe we've got a minute for that.
Comment, John. I just wanted to thank you for all the work you've done over the many years on this project, and it's really an important advance. And I wanted to also say that I think there's a lot of secondary aspects of this program that are difficult to measure. Things like, how many of the nurses in these small hospitals were able to get neonatal resuscitation training or, learn how to do neonatal resuscitation because of this program. And to extend that even to the midwives, how many of them learned pulse oximetry and how to apply it. I think there's a lot of secondary things that are a little difficult to measure.
Yeah, I think the midwives have found that the devices have been really handy. We issued, I think, about 80 devices with that grant. And to be honest, those are the Masimo Rad 5Es. And when I talked to the guilds along the way, even up to this fall, I don't think any of those devices have failed. Some of the cords have had to be replaced, but those devices have turned out to be remarkably resilient, which has really been a bonus.
Well, keep up the good work.
Thanks, Janette. All right, well, I may have to jump off and go do an exercise test. I didn't see if there was anything else in the chat. Thanks, you guys, for letting me talk a little about something I like to talk about.
Thanks, if you could unshare for us, can you unshare it?
Yes, thanks for reminding me. All right, thanks again. See you all.
Thanks, John.
Bye.
Appreciate it. Thank you. All right, so
Well,
I
you
have
can go ahead
pleasure of
and
introducing Janette, who's our second speaker. So Janette is a professor of pediatrics in a division of cardiology with us here at Children's, and she has really pioneered the way, in her research program using magnetocardiography to really help understand with fetal electrophysiology and fetal pharmacology. And she currently is funded by work from Advancing a Healthy Wisconsin and NIH, and I think you were one of the first, Janette, to really partner with Madison. And I would like to say initiate this FPA in the partnership and research between the two institutions. So this is a really good example of how the collaborations have been very effective in advancing clinical care through research. So Janette has served on many advisory committees for NIH and been a national leader in this area of research. So looking forward to hearing what Janette has to say today. Thanks for your time and efforts, Janette.
thanks, Joy, and thank you for the pointing out that ours was one of the first forward collaborations, and so I wanted to just present some of our advances and the things that we're working on now in this field. I'm having trouble advancing the slides for some reason.
Are you on presenter mode on your screen?
Let me just check, but I thought I was.
Maybe unshare and try resharing again.
Okay. Stop sharing. I made sure I could share, but I didn't make sure I could advance my slides. So
It's okay.
let's
We'll get there.
try it again.
Yeah, try resharing.
We go. Okay, so I first wanted to thank my collaborator at UW-Madison, Dr. Wakai, who's the director of the Biomag Lab, and he and I have worked together on this since 2002 when I first came to Milwaukee, and we work with a number of cardiologists around the country and actually around the world. We're collaborating with a group in Munich right now that does the same type of work that we do, and we're actually managing a case in Munich right now of Torsades-Dupont secondary to a familial long QT syndrome. So, and also those who help us with the research, Gabby and Kaylee, and then the fetal care teams at both centers and also around the country that refer us patients. So I'm not going to go through all of our industry partners, but industry collaboration is important to us for bringing forward new types of sensors and new types of technologies that will hopefully take what we're doing in the lab to the community soon. So, and I wanted to just point out one of our new prizes from the NIH. I'm not advancing again. Why is that?
On your screen, Janette, there we go.
Okay, it may be a bandwidth issue. I apologize. Dr. Wakai and I were awarded one of the prizes through NIH for the quantum technology, and it's a stage 1 prize, but it puts us in the running for a prize of up to $1.5 million next year if we were to compete successfully with the other 10 teams. So this would be very helpful if we were to receive this, and it's for the work we're doing combining the optically pumped magnetometry with ultrasound. So you see here an ultrasound transducer that's in a holder, and these are the sensors. The yellow are the sensors for recording the fetal rhythm, and the mom lies on top of these sensors on her stomach, and I'll show you just some pictures of how that looks. So on the right hand side you can see Sharda Srinivasan from Madison doing an ultrasound through one of the side portholes in this shield. The shields are actually to create sort of a clean room inside. They're not this isn't a dangerous technology. It's not like MRI, and it doesn't produce any energy. So it's a safe technology, but it does need to be shielded from external noise. So on the left is the SQUID device. So we've used it on over 1,000 patients, and for the OPM over 100 patients. And we're getting really comparable results. You can see what the signals look like. They look by and large like an electrocardiogram. And this happens to be a baby that has long QT syndrome. So the QT interval here, I don't know if you can see my my arrow, but it's a very long QT, and there's a 2-to-1 block in this case. So we were approached this year by a company from Boston called LLG Associates, and they have partnered with the MIT's Lincoln Lab and produced a new type of sensor that they wanted to evaluate its potential for fetal MCG. So this is that sensor. It's called a solid state sensor, and it uses a rare earth metal called yttrium, and it's combined with a garnet, and then it is stable in a single layer. So they have implanted it in a single layer and surrounded it by coils that are used to eliminate noise. And they feel that this device will be able to record fetal signals without needing to be in a magnetically shielded room. And that would be a huge advance and would allow point of care evaluations in obstetrical sites all over if this will work. So we've worked with them on a number of grants this year to try to get this to the point of a prototype that we can test. So yttrium was discovered in the 1700s. It's an element number 39 on the periodic table. It has a high melting point. It has a very stable crystalline hexagonal structure. It's thin layering and paramagnetic. It's used already in various salts. So the salts with aluminum are used for YAG lasers, and the salts with iron are used in magnetic sensors and in synthetic diamonds and microwaves. And so it has one of the lowest magnetic loss rates of any of the structures found in nature. And this is what their prototype looks like. If you look at the pencil here in the top right, you can see that we've gone from a huge dewar that's suspended from the ceiling to the optically pumped magnetometers that are small but still, the size of a football, and now down to this device that's the size of a tip of a pencil. So I think this is really a huge move forward if we can bring it to use. And so this happens to be some of the advantages of the SEM, or this solid state monitor, or that it might not need to be shielded, and it has high sensitivity. Right now, the sensitivity is not as good as that for the SURF or the optically pumped magnetometers, but it is improving, and they think it will improve. So the next steps for us in okay, this should go forward. Really apologize for this. I just don't know. Let me see if maybe this will. It's got to be a bandwidth issue. So anyway, the solid state sensors, then we have the 2 grants that are in review right now with the NSF and with the NIH. And then when this is funded, we'll go ahead and do some phantom testing in the lab, both in the shield as well as without the shield, to assess whether we can develop a human prototype. And if so, then we'll move forward in a phase 2 SBIR to work on human testing in this new type of shield. So for the rest of the hour, I'd like to just review some of what we're doing clinically and review what we've learned after 25 years of evaluating fetuses with non-immune hydrops. So as you may know, immune hydrops usually is due to autoantibodies, but non-immune hydrops has many different causes, and it has many different presentations. And so it often makes it difficult for the obstetrical clinician to know what the actual rhythm is. And sometimes these rhythms are very complex. They can be a combination of bradyarrhythmias and tachyarrhythmias. This happens happens to be a fetus with really thick edema of the surface of the skin on the outside there, and then you can see fluid around the heart, and the heart itself is dysfunctional. So this is a fetal tachycardia, and it's one of the more common presentations that we see. And if it were just the typical SVT, then that would be easy. But what we learned in our evaluations is that it's not just SVT that we see in this setting. So we've now evaluated 40 fetuses over that time frame, and they've undergone 47 different studies, and they have. This represents about 4% of all the studies that we do in the lab, and they have ranged from 21 to 35 weeks gestation. The most common referral was for fetal tachycardia, but also for AV block, for cardiomyopathy, congenital heart disease, and sometimes unexplained causes of hydrops. So unfortunately, hydrops has a high mortality, and we've seen this. I'm not done with the review of our hydrops patients, so I've only had a chance to review the postnatal results on 29 of the 40. So I have given you the mortality statistics for those 29, but you can see that even with fetal tachycardia, the mortality is high, and in those with fetal tachycardia, the reason for the high mortality was because some of those were episodes of torsade. They weren't actual SVT. And for congenital heart disease, this is maybe a little falsely elevated because there were only 6 patients in this category, and one of them had a family history of long QT syndrome and as well as heterotaxy. So that's kind of an unfair comparison because of the independent risk factor of the long QT in that case. So probably the mortality is more like 50% in the congenital heart disease. So when we look at the FMCG, we're not just looking for these arrhythmias that they refer the patient for. We're really looking for other things. We're looking for hidden and brief arrhythmias, and these can be things like atrial flutter with one-to-one conduction or transient torsade, AV block. Some of the things that trigger torsade, like late coupled PVCs, and then T-wave alternans. And again, that's another unstable finding, often triggers arrhythmias. And then we're also looking for hypertrophy or the findings of increased amplitude of the signals and looking at the relationship between atrial and ventricular amplitudes. We're looking at the cardiac time intervals, like whether there's first degree AV block or bundle branch block. We're especially looking at repolarization abnormalities because we know that those are often associated with life-threatening arrhythmias. And then finally, we're looking for ischemic changes or STT wave changes. And so it's really a comprehensive electrophysiologic evaluation that we do in a matter of about 3 hours with these patients. So I don't have time to go through all the different categories that we've seen, but I wanted to focus specifically on inherited arrhythmia syndromes because of the 40 patients, we determined that 8 of them had these inherited arrhythmia syndromes, and those represented 20% of all the hydrops cases. And so only 2 of those patients were recognized prior to coming to the lab as having either an IAS rhythm or an IAS history. And so in 6 cases, the only way this was diagnosed was with the FMCG. So you can see here the different kinds of inherited arrhythmia syndromes that we saw. SCN5A is known to have the highest mortality. And of those 8 that had the inherited arrhythmia syndromes, 6 of the 8 had the life-threatening ventricular tachycardia called torsade. 7 of the 8 had periods of second-degree block. And in addition to those findings, all of them had at least one other finding of significance as listed on the bottom row there. And these are usually pretty significant. So most of the patients with inherited arrhythmias were referred late. And I think that one thing that comes out of our review is that we will, in the future, hopefully be able to get referrals earlier in the course of these patients' hydrops, because I think in many cases there's actionable treatments that we can offer and risk-reducing treatments. So, for example, one patient had symptoms of ectopy at 11 weeks of gestation and then was weeks, developed second-degree block at 20 weeks, and was finally referred at 30 weeks for tachycardia. So there was a 19-week delay in referral, and that patient had been placed on amiodarone for the tachycardia, which is one of the known proarrhythmic drugs for long QT syndrome. And so we found that in another case as well, that during the time they were, hadn't referred the patient, the second-degree block was treated with terbutaline, which is very proarrhythmic as well. So once we have a diagnosis, then we can begin treatment through their home centers with magnesium, a beta blocker, and we did that routinely for the patients that had Torsades. The mortality in our experience, because so many of them were referred late, was 4 of 4 with the de novo. We know they have a high risk of death because of the de novo types of gene defects. These are ones that are not present in either parent. And so we also had 2 of the patients with familial that had mortality as well. One was the one with heterotaxy, so that probably was specifically causing it. So I want to just show you some of the things we see. So on the top left tracing, you can see the 2 of the fetal sensors, and you see an up-down pattern if you look at the T wave after the QRS. So the T wave is up and then down, and that's called T wave alternans. It's due to calcium signaling and instability of the calcium signaling. In this case, within a few seconds, this patient transitioned over to 2-to-1 heart block. And so with the 2-to-1 heart block, you can see that the T wave is so long that it actually extends beyond the middle P wave there. So in this case, the heart is in relative refractoriness and really could not conduct 1-to-1 because of the length of the QT interval. This is just an example of the very first case we reported back in 2003. The PVCs often induce the tachycardia. You can see here Torsades it's known as turning around the points is the French interpretation of Torsade, and the rhythm is often fast, and when it is fast, it doesn't open the aortic valve, and because it doesn't open the semilunar valves, you actually don't detect it as tachycardia when you're doing an echo. It looks more like ectopy than it does like a tachycardia. So it's different intrinsically than SVT in the way that it presents. And the other problem with Torsade is that it's not always fast. So this is a fetus. If you look at the heart rate trend at the top, it's very flat, but you see these little blips here. But the rates are under 200 beats per minute, and you can see what this VT looks like in this case on the lower in the lower fetal panel. And so this is really at a rate of about 150 to 200 beats per minute. So in that setting, it can be mistaken for other types of rhythms that are not Torsade. And we have a patient coming in 2 weeks from from Baylor in Austin that has a type of VT that's at a rate of about 140 beats per minute. And we don't know if that's, similar to this or if it's more of a benign type of ventricular arrhythmia. So, and if in some situations, these types of inherited arrhythmias can be so bizarre that they've never been actually seen on a postnatal ECG because these babies end up with fetal demise. So these rhythms, in some cases like this one, may be actually incompatible with life. This family chose to terminate their pregnancy. They had chosen before they came to see us, but as far as the types of treatments, I think that, we do have treatments that we can offer, and hopefully they will make a difference. So in the last couple slides, I just want to show you some other examples of things that we see. This happens to be a fetus that doesn't have long QT syndrome, but does have these really prolonged decelerations in association with the high drops. This was also a case where there was not an urgent need to deliver because the family had opted for palliative care. But you can see the ST depression in the top rhythm strip down below. So it's really impressive ST depression. This is a case we reported with the group in Minneapolis, and you can see the ascites here on the right, and the heart is surrounded by fluid. This baby had congenital heart disease, and you don't see a mitral valve. There was actually an absence of the mitral valve, so it was called an unguarded mitral valve. And this baby had been getting worse with, even though the flecainide had controlled the atrial flutter, the baby was getting worse. And what we found at the FMCG was that the reason for that likely was that the fetus was having one-to-one conduction at very rapid rates during just small amounts of time. But this cannot be good for your heart when you have congenital heart disease. And so they were able to add digoxin, and later we reported this case. But that's another example of how FMCG can add to the diagnosis that echo has already provided, in ways that would not be easily detectable by ultrasound, because unfortunately ultrasound is one of those on-off type recordings that it makes it difficult to see really brief things that last only a matter of, say, 30 seconds. So in summary, advances in quantum technologies have led to downsizing and lowering of the potential cost of FMCG, but they haven't been realized by the market yet. And that's largely because of the need to do further work with industry on refinements of shielding and development of new types of sensors. There's the possibility that the sensors may not require shielding if what our colleagues in Boston say is true. And then the fetal MCG has many diagnostic advantages, and it augments echo diagnosis, but sometimes it actually reveals distinctly different diagnoses than what had been thought to be present at referral. And so in those situations when we can stop the proarrhythmic drugs like amiodarone or terbutaline, it could be life-saving. So, and then combining the evaluation with ultrasound simultaneous with FMCG to screen high-risk cases with things such as fatal bradycardia or hydrops could really improve overall detection of electromechanical alterations. So I think one lesson in all of this is that if we can see these patients early in their course, when we can, get a more detailed and accurate diagnosis, it does make a difference. And in the patients with Torsades, we've been successful in managing 6 or 8 cases of Torsades. This is just the Torsades cases with hydrops. We've had many cases of Torsades where there hasn't been hydrops, where we've also been successful in treating it in utero. So we probably, I don't know exactly, but probably around 12 cases we've treated in utero. And like I mentioned, right now we're treating a case in Munich with a patient who's there, and we were able to make that diagnosis through the Munich lab. And actually we were able to warn the OB team in southern Germany that the baby might develop Torsades, and in fact the baby did go on to develop Torsades. So now the baby's in the hospital, the mom's in the hospital on a IV mag and getting oral propranolol, and hopefully we'll get the baby to 37 weeks. We'll see. So that's all I had today, and I'd be glad to answer any questions if there are any.
Thanks, Janette. Any questions for Janette? Janette, we have many aspiring trainees on the call. What challenges have you faced? Do you think the biggest challenges you face going through to execute the research in the clinical space?
I think that's really a good question, Joy, because I really think there's a lot of ways we can work to implement more education early on for people who are interested in human subjects research. I think the important things are to understand human subjects research through the training programs with the city training program, as well as with the FDA. I think any education in the FDA can be beneficial because you learn about about, some of the rules that are there. And then, of course, grant writing is always something that's, takes time to learn. And I mean, I would say Joy is one of the super grant writers in our area, but I know it is something that takes time, and it really helps to partner with people that are more senior and more experienced with grant writing when you're working on your first few grants. I really would encourage the K programs and some of the early training programs for researchers, and then also the grant writing courses. I know Joyce put together a grant writing course, and I think those are really helpful. I think one of the things that's really important is to be aware of the changes that occur in the regulatory arena. So, for example, recently we obtained a travel grant, but there's now these restrictions on collaboration internationally. So we were aware of that. We took it to the medical college. They approved our travel and our association with this. So I think sometimes if you just stay within the bounds of what you are supposed to be doing, make sure you're submitting your conflicts of interest, and for me, we've tried to keep our conflicts of interest with industry confined to NIH grants, which helps a lot. So that's why we use the SBIR and STTR mechanisms, because it can fund portions of our salary and people in the lab, but it doesn't have the same conflict of interest as, say, dealing with industry directly funding your research.
Yeah.
So that's all I would say. So do you have any comments on that, Barry? What other things would you add, Joy, to that?
I mean, you're right. I think it's just knowing what you're dealing with, right? And planning and being prepared for that to move forward, because you never know what roadblocks are going to come ahead, but there are some things that you can prepare for ahead of time. Any additional questions for Janette?
Hi,
Okay.
This is Allie Mitchell. Oh, hello. Thank you so much. These were just two incredibly exciting presentations. And Janette, your work is so innovative and cutting edge. It's incredibly important and exciting. Thank you. I was just wondering if you might comment a little more about your experience working through the SBIR, STTR mechanism, and how you think that that opportunity, in the near future might look like, and just some of the other advantages of working with those types of opportunities in the context of working potentially here in Wisconsin.
Yeah, I think the SBIR and STTR programs are underutilized by academic people, and a part of that is that the grants usually have to go in from the industry partner, but I can say that all of our partnerships have been cold calls. They've really been things that we've approached them or they've approached us, and usually to solve a problem, and the ultimate goal with these programs is a commercial product. So, I think that they are in multiple stages. Usually the first stage is kind of like we're doing with this that I presented today, to develop a prototype device of some kind. And then the second stage is much bigger. It's, up to $3 million, and that can be to test this in human subjects. And then there's a commercialization phase that can also be funded, but it's money that is set aside by the NIH to develop U.S. industry, and it's only for U.S. industry, but yet it's, I think, one that really can fund a lot of new development. And I would encourage all of you to think about that as a way. I mean, we've personally, neither Dr. Wakai or I have a business ourselves. We are scientists, but there are people who do have their own businesses within academics as well. So I think you should definitely plan on looking at that as one of the mechanisms for funding, especially in this time when it's really hard to get funding otherwise.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right, I think we're at time, but I'd like to thank the two speakers and everybody for attending and the questions and discussion. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.